Book Buzz, HarperCollins Book Buzz. Check it out. Do-do-do, Book Buzz, HarperCollins Book Buzz. Brought to you by Library Love Fest.
That's the song that keeps on giving. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back to our third installment of Galley Club. I am Virginia Stanley, who is with me here.
Lainey Mays.
Katie, hey everyone. Oh, sorry, Katie.
Sorry.
We are so excited to have our author Katie Gutierrez with us. So Galley Club, this is the third installment. This is the April installment of Galley Club, a book club for librarians where the book is in galley form. You meet the team who worked on the book. And if you were here last week, you met the editor and the agent of this book. And you get to ask questions of the author. And this month you will meet right now on your screen, Katie Gutierrez, the author of More Than You'll Ever Know, the selection for April. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for taking the time. We are so excited. The buildup for this has been so much fun. This is your debut. I'm going to do a brief bio about you, and then I'm going to hand it over to you to talk a little bit about the book. And folks, we encourage questions and comments. This is a great opportunity for you to meet the author and ask your questions about this book, which is so much. There's so much in this book, which is why we chose it. It's for sure a page turner. It is so much more than a whodunit. It's perfect for book clubs, hence Galley Club, and it offers so much to think about. It's a wonderful quote from Julia Fine, which I do want to read, but right now I'm going to read a little bio of Katie Gutierrez. Katie, author of this wonderful debut that has so many people buzzing at Harper, More Than You'll Ever Know, which will be published by William Morrow in June of 2022. So not too far off. You have an MFA from Texas State University, and your writing has appeared in Time, Harper's Bazaar, The Washington Post, Long Reads, and more. You live in San Antonio with your husband and your two kids. And we're so excited because next week, we're actually going to meet you in person at the Texas Library Association. So super, super excited about that. Super excited to have you on today. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
So first off, I think it would be so much fun to hear from you, because we can just go on for forever, but without giving away too much, yet at the same time, everyone knows that this episode, there may be spoilers. So sorry, but we told you from the beginning, read it, because when the author comes on, spoilers may be something that happens. So, Katie, why don't you give viewers sort of a snapshot, if you will, an elevator pitch, or just a general idea of what this book is about?
Sure. The book is about Laura Rivera, who's a South Texas woman who secretly is married to two men at the same time during the peso devaluation of the 1980s, and Cassie Bowman, who is an aspiring true crime writer today in Austin, who becomes obsessed with telling Laura's story. And in the process, the two women form a relationship that neither one of them fully expects. And what comes out of the relationship kind of threatens to expose some secrets that they both initially would rather stay hidden. And it's sort of an exploration on marriage, motherhood, female agency, desire, ambition, of course, true crime, and all of the moral ambiguities that come with it.
Yes. Well, as we said, there's a lot to it, and we have questions and librarians have questions. So I do want to read this one quote from Julia Fine, the author of The Upstairs. There's so many raves. Folks, if you go on Edelweiss, you'll see for yourself. It's just page after page of wonderful blurbs about this book. Kirkus gave it a starred review. But I love this quote from Julia Fine, who says, "As addictive as a real-life whodunit, with thoughtful attention to the ethical implications of the true crime genre, more than you'll ever know, explores how we entangle ourselves one choice at a time and what it costs to unravel the damage." Okay. Much there. Lainey, Essie, ask a few questions. We've got some really good ones here. So why don't you start it off and then we'll go into the chat room.
Sure. So I want to ask about the true crime element, because Cassie is a true crime writer, maybe not writing some of the things she would like to be writing at some moments. And I think there's a lot of discussion. As someone who loves true crime, I appreciated the discussion of the different views that we have for women and men in true crime, or even as like true crime lovers. It sounds wrong to say that, but the women who love that, and like, is it bad to like that? I don't know if you want to talk about writing, Cassie writing these true crime elements, and maybe did your thoughts change any while writing this?
Yeah, great question. So I think first, I think I have complicated feelings toward true crime, which, you know, I was using the novel to try to explore, because I also love it and feel weird about loving it. And I think that for as long as I've been reading, you know, I started off reading sort of Nancy Drew books, and then it went to, you know, like Patricia Cornwell when I was 12 or 13, and, you know, very much like crime oriented fiction. You know, I watched like Unsolved Mysteries was a big thing that I used to watch with my parents as a kid. And as I grew older, you know, I think the complexity and the nuance of the books that I read and the shows that I watched changed, but there was always somewhat of a darker crime element to them. And I think that it wasn't really until sort of more recent years, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that I started to kind of question, like, why do I like these shows? They always seem to revolve around, you know, a dead woman or girl, or a girl or a woman in peril. She's usually white, young, pretty. There's a certain type, you know, once you start paying attention and sort of interrogating these shows, you start to see these real common threads between them in who gets represented as a victim. And I started reading writers, you know, like Alice Boleyn, who wrote Dead Girls, Rachel Monroe, who wrote Savage Appetites. And both of those writers are such brilliant thinkers on the true crime genre, and really exploring, you know, why do we have this cultural obsession with it? And also, you know, true crime, I think, comes on a spectrum, right? Cassie is writing for this very sort of trashy blog that's all about the sensational crime. It's that quick fix, right? And then there's, of course, much more thoughtful and nuanced true crime. I just read, I knew I was going to blank. I always blank on book titles when I'm talking about them, but it's a true crime book by...
The librarians will probably know if you describe it to them. I'm sure
First
they
name
will.
of the author is Erica. It starts off, the title has something to do with her face. She has a very open face that encourages strangers to sort of confess their secrets to her. I cannot believe, Tell Me Everything. That's what it's called. Tell Me Everything. And it's a remarkable work that it's this combination of beautiful prose, a really thoughtful exploration of true crime, but also of her own role at working as a private investigator for an attorney, and they were instrumental in sort of filing this, I believe, don't quote me, but I think it was a big civil lawsuit against a university for essentially creating a culture of sexual assault and rape. And she, you know, also has personal experience with similar trauma. And the work that she does in this book is so multi-layered, so important. And part of what makes it so good is because she is using her own voice as somebody who both investigated the crime, this type of crime, and also experienced it herself. And so I think when true crime is at its best, I think it's being told by the people who are directly impacted by crime itself, and who are looking at it not just from a personal lens, but a larger systemic lens. And so I'm also I'm very passionate about the role that I think good true crime can play, but very conflicted when it comes to the fact that true crime is entertainment as well. And so I think I was interested in exploring the dynamic between these questions and how a writer would address her own obsession with it when she also has these very real biases that she's not even aware of, and how those biases might impact the work that she's doing, when at the same time she has her own ambition as well. And ambition can be very selfish. So, and I don't say that with judgment, but that also I think comes into play as well when you're thinking about a writer's own career in true crime. So I don't know if that answers, but those were some of the questions I was wanting to sort of explore.
I love that. And I also love the turning of thought of like, who is telling this compared to like, who's absorbing this,
Right.
Like there's other, I guess, responsibilities that you have to do telling it and even as an observer myself. So yeah, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
You kind of open the book with that too. With watching Dateline and just, questioning that right away, that the scene is set about that. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about on Edelweiss, everyone. There's a terrific piece written by Katie about why you wrote the book. My question really is kind of twofold, but I think it's fascinating about, what comes first, the story or the characters, and you sort of answer that in the piece that you've written, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because it's very fascinating where the germ for this comes from.
Sure, yeah. So the germ for this came probably 15-ish years ago, 12, 15 years ago. I happened to just come across the story of a man who had been found to live this double life. He was married to one woman for about 30 years. She died, and then he married a second woman 2 weeks later. And after that, people started to question, hey, well, have they been having an affair? What was going on? It turned out that only 20 miles away, he'd been living with her. He'd fathered, I think, 2 children with her as well. So he had 2 families that were living 20 miles away from each other. The wives, I think, had served on the same school board at different times. The kids went to the same school. He'd bought the same brand of white Lexus for both wives, and neither family knew about the other. And at the time, I was newly engaged, and I was, sort of repulsed by it on a personal level, thinking about, you all of your best intentions, you're going into a lifelong commitment with somebody, and yet you could potentially miss this huge thing in them. And what does that mean for marriage? But, as a writer, I was like, well, that's incredibly fascinating. How does somebody compartmentalize to that extent? And even at the time, I sort of had, I had this idea of, it's always men who live these double lives, which makes sense because, generally, women are, especially historically speaking, women have borne the brunt of childcare. Women are usually the ones who carry and have babies. They kind of have often the evidence of childbirth on their bodies. It's a more difficult secret to keep for a woman. Whereas for a man, especially, let's say 30 years ago when the book was set, if men are traveling more, it was just, I think, a lot easier for men to live this kind of double life. But I was more interested in what would happen if a woman did it. What would her emotional landscape be? What would her motivations be? How would she compartmentalize it? Especially considering the fact that, romance scams are sort of known to be a man's crime, according to the FBI. And they usually come down to money to some extent. And I thought that if it were a woman, I think that I always conceived of the crime as being more emotional, less about a money con and more about something within her that she was needing or missing or looking for. So I was really compelled by the idea of a woman who was living that kind of double life. And at the time I was working on a short story collection for my MFA program, and the story didn't seem to fit the collection and it seemed bigger than that. So I sort of put it away, shelved it in the back of my head. And then years later, so in 2017, I had gotten divorced. I was remarried. I had just found out I was pregnant, and my first book, which we can discuss, had gone on submission and not sold. And so I was talking with my agent about, well, what could the next project be? And this idea was still very compelling to me. And I thought that I had, I'd had a lot of life since my early 20s, and the motherhood aspect felt newly compelling to me, obviously being newly pregnant. And then also the true crime aspect collided with it as well. When I started to consider how would she pull it off in this age of hyperconnectivity, right? So I started to think, well, maybe it should be set in the past. When could that be? And the pieces started falling into place after that. So once it sort of hit me that it needed to be in the 80s, I thought, okay, well, where would it take place? And my first thought was my own hometown of Laredo, Texas, which at the time, that would have been around the year I was born. And at the time, it was going through this major economic recession. The peso had devalued. My parents had a lot of stories from that time that have always been really interesting to me. And so it felt like setting it there and having her be a woman, it felt right. And as soon as those two pieces came, Lore came to me almost whole. And it wasn't, and Cassie was sort of the second piece. I'd always envisioned sort of a framework for the story. I was always, like we were talking about, very interested in true crime. I was already sort of interrogating my interest in true crime. So it felt like, how would the story change if it were being told by somebody else? If we're looking at it from two prisms, from Lore's perspective, but also the perspective of a second narrator who's essentially going to be writing the story for her own end to a particular audience, how would her vision of the person, the place, the time, the genre of true crime, how would that change the definition of the truth itself and how it happened? So it's a long-winded answer, but I think that's how it took, I guess, 15 years for all of those pieces to sort of cohere.
That's fantastic. I mean, that really does fill in so many of the blanks on the depth and the complexity that's woven throughout the book.
Yeah, thank you.
I loved how Lore's character just kind of shined through her chapters. I mean, if last week when we were talking to Jessica and Hillary, they both said that we didn't even have to keep reading through Lore's chapters because she was so alive and vibrant, and like there was nothing that they could even add to it. But speaking about characters, they did also mention that Fabian is your father's favorite, and I was hoping you could tell us why.
Yes, my dad, Fabian's #1 fan. I think that my dad sees a lot of himself in Fabian, and I think for good reason, because my dad owned an electrical supply store at the time here in Laredo. And I think in some ways I sort of, Fabian was sort of inspired by my dad in those ways. Fabian has an ironworks store. When I envisioned the ironworks store, I very much kind of envisioned, my dad's electrical supply store. We used to play in the warehouse when we were kids, just like Gabriel and Mateo do. We would have our Saturday lunches. My dad actually did move up to Austin for a time during that recession to try to drum up business for the store while my mom had me at home. So I think my dad can definitely see pieces of himself in Fabian and probably pieces of those years. So he always felt a closeness with Fabian. He always said, Fabian needs to be on the cover. We need a sequel about Fabian. Nobody appreciates Fabian, the sacrifices he's made. So yes, my dad, Fabian's #1 fan.
Very funny. So we have questions from some librarians. So I guess we'll get to those and then we'll come back to some more questions from us. So let's see, we have lots of people checking in from Ohio and North Carolina, New Jersey. Jennifer Monahan Winbury has tons of questions. Okay. People are very excited about the book. Let's see. Okay, Kimberly McGee says, I love this book. It is the best of true crime with a deep love of family.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Christine Huntley says, really intrigued by the idea of a woman committing bigamy and how the drama is going to unfold with the husbands finding about each other. That's the thing, that you've turned this on its head is just brilliant. And to set it when you did, so smart, that there really isn't any way to really trace this. We have Lillian Dabney here from Seattle, and Jennifer Winberry, who had many questions last week. She attended the conversation with your editor and your agent, and she just loved the timelines back and forth. But she says the structure of the narrative, how Cassie's story in the present was told in the third person in the past tense, and Lore's story from the 80s was told in the first person but in the present tense. And then when Lore brought her story to the present, both narratives were from the first person but in the past tense. That is who's on first. I don't know who's on second. But makes total sense if you've read the book.
Yeah, I love that comment. That was, of course, a very intentional decision. First of all, I wanted the sections that were set in the past to feel immediate. And so it felt right to put them in the present. But I also wanted to play with the idea of those sections standing out from the others. So if you've read the full book, I know we've talked about there being spoilers, but I hope this doesn't ruin it for anybody. But I wanted those sections to stand out in the end as kind of a separately constructed text, so that it would be clear for those who were really thinking about it that they were Cassie's book. That's part of what Cassie herself constructed. But I also wanted to play with the idea of the past never really being past. As these characters find out, the past very much influences the present, impacts our actions, our decisions, everything. The past is never really past. And so I liked the idea of setting the past in the present for those reasons, and then making the present day narratives, to me, third person, or, telling a present day story in past tense feels like the most unobtrusive way for me to tell it. And so in some ways I wanted the Lotus sections to stand out more so than the present day sections. And then Cassie, that was actually her, and she was told in the first person, and that was actually real trial and error. Cassie took a lot of work to sort of bring up to the level that my agent and editor felt that Lore was. And so I initially started out with Cassie in third person, sort of match, but there was a distance that I couldn't seem to broach. Whereas interestingly, Lore, despite being third person, felt very intimate to me from the start. But Cassie, I felt like I couldn't crack her in the third person. And so I ended up having to rewrite, I think 120 or so pages of her sections and shift them from third to first. And then that also, that really kind of changed her voice for me and revealed her voice to me in a new way. It felt almost more youthful. First person also kind of has, to me, the characteristic of being almost less reliable. A character can be telling the story, telling the truth as they're experiencing it and as they're perceiving it. But also if a story is being told in first person, I think for me as a reader, there's always an awareness of they're constructing it in a certain way to make me feel a certain thing, even if the character, him or herself, is not aware of it. And so I wanted to play with that as well for her character, because to me, Cassie and her narration and understanding of the truth was a very big part of the story.
There's so much psychology in these characters. It's amazing.
Thank you.
I also really like the first and third, because I think of like the difference between if I was like in a documentary, whereas like that would be one viewpoint, or like if I was doing a commentary for a DVD, like you have time to step away and think about things. So I really like that connection that you.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
We've got more questions. Essie, Lainey, we've got questions.
Yeah, I can start asking a few on Crowdcast. Speaking of the psychology behind these characters, actually, Laura wants to know, did you research with a psychologist to get the correct personality traits for women who live a double life?
I did not. I mean, I did research into some of the qualities that I thought Lore would inhabit. So for example, I thought that Lore would be, very charming. I always envisioned her as being somewhat selfish, being able to sort of rationalize her choices in that way. I think requires a very real amount of selfishness and I wanted her to be a combination of very self-aware, but also she's doing these things that are sort of inherently delusional, right? Like you can't, nobody can actually think that the life that she was creating with both families was sustainable. So I think that I was more interested in how would the world perceive somebody like her. And I think that we are very quick to slap labels on people, and in particular women who are behaving outside of societal norms and expectations. There's always the conversation about unlikable female characters, and I really wanted to play with that as well. But I think, with the initial article that Cassie finds about Lore, and how the writer of that article is very quick to suggest she's, maybe she's a psychopath, maybe she's a sociopath, maybe she's a narcissist. I wanted to kind of just like be a little tongue in cheek with that and say, like, I sort of want to suggest, I guess, that those to apply labels like that to a person is very easy, and it can fool us into thinking that we know the entirety of them based on those singular labels. And so really I wanted to spend the rest of the book saying, I'm not going to label her. I'm not going to label her. I'm going to explore her and see, and kind of, the idea that the blurb that you read from Julia Fine, talking about kind of how we entangle ourselves one choice at a time. I wanted to play with that idea more than anything else. The idea that to some extent, it could be any of us who find ourselves in some kind of outlandish situation based on based on decisions that we make moment to moment versus any kind of overarching extreme psychology, if that makes sense.
In total sense, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So we have a question from Kimberly McGee, going back to time period a little. So you set this in 1985. Do you think that Lore would have been able to pull this off today? Did you set it at that time period because you wouldn't have had to worry about cell phones, which we talked about a little bit, but and she said, P.S. loved your description of life in Austin, and the shout out to Leslie. Yeah.
Miss Leslie. Yes. I lived in Austin for, from 2006 to 2011, I think. So 5 years after college. And yeah, Leslie was still a pretty big part of, I feel, what personified Austin at that time. But yes, in answer to the question, yes, definitely. I said it in that time period to sort of avoid some of the complications that I think would arise if somebody were trying to pull that off today. And then it also, it opened up the narrative more, because if this were happening in real time, the sort of frame narrative would be very different, right? Like a reporter would have to sort of encounter this as it were happening and be a part of untangling in some way or exposing it in some way what was going on in real time. And I was more interested in, after kind of deciding or feeling around the idea of setting it in the 80s, I was more interested in kind of exploring what has happened in Lore's life since then. Who is she today after all of this? Like, what sense have all of these characters made with what happened in their lives? What peace have they made with it? And what's at stake if somebody comes in now with kind of this very limited and maybe sensationalist understanding of what happened, and threatens to kind of like upturn everything that's happened since that time period. So I think it started off as a way to kind of avoid dealing with cell phones and social media and all of those things. But then the more I'm really instantly, when I thought about Laredo in the 1980s and then a reporter today, that felt very true to the story I was trying to tell, or that I wanted to tell.
Yeah. And I can imagine there's some misogynistic reasons that women might not be able to get away with that even further back. So that's really interesting.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually funny. I have a question on Crowdcast that kind of bounces off that what you just explained here. From Julie LaPlow, my palms are sweating as I read, and as Lore developed her double life, I had to constantly remind myself the time period was pre-cell phone. How plausible would a woman leading a double life of this nature be in 2022? Which, yeah.
I did a lot of research into double lives, into these types of double lives. And I looked really hard for women who have been found to do this. And the only woman that I found who successfully led a double life was Anais Nin, the writer. Well, same as Cassie found, right? And that was, I want to say back in the 60s. I could definitely be wrong about the decade, but it was about 11 years that she did it between New York and California. So again, before cell phones, before social media, anything like it. So the fact that I haven't found any other woman who has been known to do it suggests that it would not be very easy to pull off in today's age. Or most ages,
like
for different reasons. It's a lot of work.
That's so weird to think about, because it seems like social media and like how advanced it's gotten, how we could put private mode or anything, like it feels like it should be easier. Not that it should be, not like it's a good thing, but it feels like it could be easier now. And you're right, it's probably not. It probably made things 10 times more difficult.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that too, because, like, I don't know if you guys have seen like the Tinder Swindler documentary. So people are still doing this, to certain extents and in different ways. Anna Delvey, like all of these stories, I think people are, at least I am, inherently fascinated in others who live these double lives. And so, social media, I think, can, probably, like you're saying, like support it in some ways if you're creating sort of different profiles or things like that. But I think, I don't know. I think it would have to be so intentional, so premeditated, and for different purposes, versus somebody who falls into this sort of life, who would then, I think, have to like try to erase every piece of herself that exists online in order to recreate a new one, or to just, and I think, I don't know how plausible. Yeah, I'm not sure how plausible that really is or would be. Maybe it is. Maybe there are a lot of women out there who are, bigamists and living double marriages and doing it very successfully, in which case I'd love to hear from them.
We have a question from Jennifer Winbury. She said she has a lot of questions for you. And she wants to know, she said, is the title a nod to the characters, as there is more to Lore and Cassie's story than they are telling? Or is it teasing the reader that there is much more to the story than they will figure out?
Love that. I think it's both. I definitely think it's both. I think that the title really hit me when I wrote the scene between Lore and Mateo. She's just back from the earthquake. She's taking him to the doctor. They're sitting in the car, and Mateo sort of hints for the first time at an anger that he feels over what probably feels a lot like abandonment, by both Fabian and Lore and their frequent travels. And Lore tells him that she loves him more than he'll ever know. And when I wrote that, it felt so emblematic to me of all of the characters in this book. I think it speaks to Lore's love for her family, but also very much about our relationships with the closest people in our lives, and about the fact that there's always more to people than we'll ever know, no matter how close we are to them. And then also, it definitely is a nod toward true crime, in particular, and the fact that no matter how obsessed we become about a particular crime story, we can dive into endless rabbit holes. We can watch documentaries, we can read books, but ultimately the only people who know what happens in a crime are the victim and the perpetrator, and they will have two very different versions of events. So when it comes to true crime, I think it's absolutely true that there's always more than we, the reader or consumer, will ever know. And I definitely wanted that to be a very direct nod in that direction.
Yeah. Well, we have a question that kind of pulls together two of the last statements. So true crime, as well as you were saying, like, if anyone's living a double life, let me know. Someone wants to know, I think Kim McGee wants to know, have you ever wanted to write a true crime book?
Interesting. It's never been a particular ambition of mine, just because I've always considered myself a fiction writer. I write essays, but I've never really had the ambition to write a nonfiction book. But I think that if I ever did write a nonfiction book, I think I probably would be drawn to true crime.
Thanks. I think Essie has some questions.
Yeah, there are more over on Crowdcast here.
Yeah.
Let me see. There's one from Casey Davis. I love the dual language aspect to your storytelling. It gives great authenticity to the story. Do you feel that there's better representation in novels today?
Yes, better than I grew up with, definitely. I mean, I mentioned often, it feels like the fact that I only read one book by a Mexican American author or a Latinx author of any kind, for the first 20 years of my life. And that was Sandra Cisneros, 7th grade, The House on Mango Street. And I remember reading it in class, and it was the first time I had seen Spanish in a book, or Spanglish. And I remember thinking like, what is this? Like, you can't, this is the way we talk. Yeah. But like, you can't do this in a book. Like, this can't be real literature, because, this wasn't what I had seen, or wasn't what any of us had seen. And that was the only book. That was the only book I ever read that had any kind of, Spanish bilingualism in it by a Latinx author, until I was well into college and afterwards. And so I really internalized for a long time that, I've been writing stories since I was a kid, and I used to write all my stories like no characters had last names. They all took place in sort of these nameless cities. And I always said I was trying to make the stories universal, right? So that the average reader would be able to relate and understand. And it really wasn't until I was, probably in my late 20s that I realized that my assumption was that the average reader was a white reader, and that the average reader wouldn't be able to relate or care to relate to, characters who were like me and the people I grew up with and the place that I grew up in, which is so sad because, I grew up, Laredo, as y'all have seen in the book, is very much like a Mexican American bubble. When I was growing up, it was 99% of Mexican descent. And so, I think I had the privilege of growing up in the majority, and with all the privileges that come with being in a majority, which is, I never felt like being Mexican was less than being white. I never felt not valuable or not worthy of the same things that white people were worthy of. I never doubted that I could be a writer because my last name was Gutierrez, right? But at the same time, here I was like just completely gatekeeping myself from telling these stories because I had just never seen them. So, later, like a few years ago, I actually did some research because I was curious about the fact, I was curious whether there were in fact many more books that were published at the time that I just didn't know about, or whether the landscape when it came to, Latinx writers was like as bone dry as it seemed. And there was a piece I wrote for Bustle a few years ago. And there was a quote that I found in the New York Times from like 1996. And it was by somebody who was basically saying there should be more Hispanic literature, but his quote was like, some of the most vibrant books are by Hispanic authors, but they're being published in ghetto bookshops. And like, it was something that was so this was an ally speaking, but he was speaking about, Mexican American literature, Latino literature in this way that felt just like inherently derogatory. And it was, back then, if you look, I mean, there were so few titles that were published by, Latino or Latina authors, by Black authors, by Asian authors. Like it's really depressing when you look back. And so has representation improved? Yes, definitely. But is it where it needs to be? In my opinion, no. I think that there have definitely been surveys published in the last few years that still show publishing inside and out, when it comes to staff within publishing, but then also the authors they publish are still overwhelmingly white. We're looking at between 70 and 80%, I think, in most cases. So yes, it's better, but there is a long, long way to go. And it's exciting, when I see lists pop up and I see fellow, Latinx writers on there, the fact that I can name half a dozen books by Latinx writers coming out, in the next few months or this year is really exciting to me because that's more than there's ever been, right? But it's half a dozen. So, it's still, I think there's a long way to go.
Yeah. And I found that article because I'm interested to read, and I'll put that in the chat for everybody.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's really great how you brought up how like using your last name as your own it's just like my last name is Ramirez and I like to write too. And it's just, I was told that I should use a pen name. Like when I was in school, like you should use a pen name, that'll sell more. And it's what? And so I'm glad that that's changing, and I'm glad it's becoming you're right, it's getting better, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah. Gosh, that's crazy that you were told that. I mean, I believe it. Yeah.
Let's see, more questions. Well, I think we may have answered Jennifer's question. And how much detail did you plot out the book? Did you write the dual narrative at the same time? And did any of the characters surprise you?
Yeah, great question. So I tend to do character work first. I spend a lot of time in the beginning. I use, it's called Proust's Questionnaire. It used to be like a parlor game many, many years ago. And Proust thought that if you had a person answer all of the questions in this questionnaire, which I think there might be 30 or 35 questions, that it reveals the essence of who they are. And I encountered it at some point online, and I thought, well, these are really, these could be really great questions to ask of a character, just to kind of help me as the writer get to know them. And so that's it's always my first exercise, is to do Proust's questionnaire for my main characters until I feel like I know them to an extent that I can start writing. So I did that with Lore and Cassie, and I definitely did more for Lore than Cassie, which is probably why it was so problematic with Cassie for a long time. And then after that, I think my outlines are sort of more like a list of scenes that I can already imagine. And they're very much in sort of one sentence form, just to get them down. And I don't ever know how a book is going to end. I feel like I never know more than sort of 60 or 70% of a book when I get started. And even then is pretty vague. I think if I have a good grasp of the characters and a good grasp of how the story will begin, then I'll just begin and go from there, which is what I did here. And so actually in this case, this book changed so much because the first 150 pages were only in Lore's point of view. It was only those 1980s chapters. And then it switched abruptly to Cassie's perspective in the present day. And my idea was that the next third would be in her perspective. And then the final third would be their perspectives would intertwine and alternate. And when I sent it to my agent, she was like, yeah, no, this is not working. She said, that you're so invested in Lore at that point that to kind of bring the reader out so late in the game was just not successful. And particularly because Cassie was not yet up to the level of depth, I guess, that Lore was. And so at that point, we started playing with different ways to intertwine the chapters. My agent and I, we worked a lot together on this, bless her. And yeah, so we started, I think we felt right away after that conversation that the chapters needed to alternate from the beginning. And so I worked on sort of splicing the story so that it would work in that way. But ultimately, those first, let's say 150 pages that I wrote from Cassie's perspective almost got rewritten almost entirely, I would say. And then once the individual storylines felt strong, then it was about weaving them together in a way that they would play off each other successfully. So yeah, that was all a very long process. Many drafts.
And again, it's a really interesting conversation. If you guys want to go back, if you missed last week's episode, which was the conversation between Katie's editor and agent, and it's a fascinating look at how, in general, how books are submitted and the whole process, but in particular Katie's, and what exactly made them made the agent and an editor just say, oh, we have to have this. So it's really cool. Let's see, Lainey, is there a question from Maureen and Essie? There's some Crowdcast questions, and we're at 2:45, so we'll go through them quickly.
Sorry, Lainey, you can go first.
It doesn't matter. So Maureen Roberts asked, how important was it to you to explore the different ways female desire can manifest?
Very important. I felt like, so obviously this only takes one look at that, right? Because, Lora is, she is heterosexual, she's cisgendered. So there are obviously many, many, many other ways that female desires can manifest. And so I was in this book interested in looking specifically at marriage and at I was interested in looking at how a woman who is married to somebody and who still loves that person could fall in love with a different man, and what that second love could illuminate about herself. And I think that was the aspect that was most interesting to me, of like, how would Lore change through loving somebody else? And in this case, it happens to be another man. But I wanted to kind of illuminate how female desire is as much about our relationship with ourselves as it is about our relationship with the object of desire, and sort of, play with those ideas a bit. But yeah, I think that question was really top of mind for me in terms of exploring, what love that is equal but different might look like in these two relationships, and how a woman might justify lying and hurting two men that she genuinely does love in different ways, but who also, I guess, is invested enough in herself to make excuses and continue living this life because of what those different loves bring to her.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
There's a question from Donna Wilder. You're an inspiration to all mothers trying to juggle both a career and family. Do you agree that the greatest gift you can give to your children is your own fulfilled happiness?
Yes, definitely. I'm working on a piece this morning that's very much about this. The pandemic has been really hard, obviously, on so many families, so many parents, so many mothers in particular. And I really felt that, during the pandemic, and really until fairly recently, it was this like shrinking of the world. And, we've been very cautious with our kids. They're both under 5. I have a 4-year-old, newly 4, and a 1.5-year-old. And the little one is like more susceptible to respiratory viruses. He gets like, his colds can turn into pneumonia really quickly. And so we were always and still are, very cautious about COVID. And so, we didn't have childcare. We stayed at home. Our daughter wasn't in school until this past March. And yeah, it's been really hard. It's been hard on work. It's been hard on, sort of remembering who we are as people and not just their parents. And I really felt, in the most restrictive times of it, especially when we were in the thick of like sleep deprivation, which with our son lasted until basically a month ago. I felt like we were out of these extreme circumstances. Our kids were suffering because we were so limited in who we could be. I felt kind of like forced to be these full-time caregivers at the loss of kind of everything outside of that, including work, including hobbies, including friends and family, creative pursuits. And I feel more than ever that, the times where I'm able to step away for an hour and do something like this, or work on something, or go for a walk, or, whatever the case may be, I come back and I am so much happier and readier, more ready to be with my kids and to actually have fun with them and enjoy them, instead of just kind of like look forward to the end of the day when they're in bed and we can just have an hour to watch something on TV. And there have been so many, these last 2 years, it's half my daughter's life, and there's been so much of that time where I felt so sad and so angry at the country and at myself for not being able to be the kind of mom that I want to be to her, because it's been just so full time, so full on, such a lack of greater support. It's not doing them any services. So yes, when I'm able to tell them, mommy's working right now, mommy's writing, look, this is the book that mommy wrote. It's really meaningful to me, and I hope will be very meaningful to them. But more importantly, having a life outside of my kids, it lets me be a better mother to my kids. And I know that now more than ever after these last couple of years.
I can't even imagine, but it's how you've managed it is beyond me, but I love that you have.
Oh, thank you.
I'm sure that your children have. And the piece that you wrote on Edelweiss, again, everybody, you can click on to the page and find it there. You say that more than anything, you wanted to write about two women who aren't all good or all bad and who struggle against the enormous consequences of their decisions. I hope I've done them justice. And I think for everybody here who's read the book, including us, we can say yes, most definitely.
Thank you.
It's really such a powerful book with so much heart and as I said, so many. It's so layered and complex, and I've loved this discussion. This has been fantastic. There are lots of people who wrote and said I can't attend, but I'm going to watch it later, and I love the book. And I would like to just as again, there are so many quotes, so many raves, but I kind of love this one, so indulge me for 1 second. It's from Luis Alberto Urrea, Pulitzer Prize finalist, best-selling author of The House of Broken Angels, and writes, "It's difficult to believe that this masterful work is a first book. Katie Gutierrez handles its dangerous turns like a Formula One driver. That elegance, darkness, even fear are deftly intertwined in the story to make it a wonderful read. More books, please."
Yeah, I pretty much passed out when I got that.
I can imagine. My goodness, what a beautiful, again, you can go on and look at all of them. There are many, but, yeah, more books, please. Sure. Just write it up and have, raise your kids and oh my goodness. But, we've filled the hour and we could keep on going, but folks, this has been terrific. And if you have not yet read the book, please, download it. It's there on Edelweiss, more than you'll ever know. It's on sale June 7th. And we're just so excited to have you here with us today. And thank you so much, Katie. I don't want to rush you off. If there's anything else that you want to say, or Essie or Lainey, if there's anything else that we want to say before we say goodbye.
Well, just to remind those people that are going to TLA, because Julie said she's envious of the librarians who get to meet you at TLA next week. And we're excited to meet you as well. But just a reminder, anyone who's going to TLA, you're signing in our booth on Wednesday, 2 to 3. So stop by and say hi.
Wait.
Please do. We can't wait. And Library Reads voters, you know what you need to do. The book is on sale in June. So May 1 is the deadline, and to get your votes in. So all the best to all of you. Stay safe, stay well. We hope to see some of you at TLA or ALA. And Katie, we'll see you next week.
Yes, absolutely. Can't wait. Thank you all so much for having me and for these amazing questions. It's been so fun.
Yeah. And I just wanted to remind everyone, we're not going to be here next week either, because we will be in Texas.
So I love that, Essie. I love that. Lucille Ball for everyone. And so just, take a break from us if you can. And Essie, maybe one more time, let's show this beautiful jacket, which we didn't even get to, but how do you love your jacket?
I do love my jacket. Yes, I love it.
It's gorgeous.
That's gorgeous. That's really something. Yeah.
I love it. They did such a beautiful, beautiful job with it. Nothing I ever could have imagined, and it's perfect.
You love it more than they'll ever know?
Yeah, exactly.
Good, Mulaney.
I love it.
All right, everyone. Well, Katie, thank you again and congratulations. And thanks for taking the time to speak with all the librarians and answering all their questions. This was terrific.
Thank you all so much for choosing the book, for having me, and for engaging with it, at this level. Like, this was just pretty extraordinary. So thank you so much.
Our pleasure, believe me. All right, everyone. Next Tuesday, we won't be here, but we'll be back with another selection for Galley Club. So stay tuned. See you soon. Bye, everyone.